now we're going to move on to adoption. So before the 1850s, adoption was really handled informally. There was no legal structure under which in this country you could create a parent-child relationship with a child that wasn't born to you. So families would take children into their homes and may never have created any kind of legal relationship with that child. So Massachusetts was the first in 1851 to pass modern adoption law. And the idea behind it was to make sure that the orders establishing the parent-child relationship were fit and proper. Nobody knows what fit and proper meant. And then also about this time was the orphan trains. So from 1854 to 1929, East Coast children that didn't have parents, didn't have a place to go, were being sent on trains to the Midwest. The idea behind it was the families that are running farms need extra hands, and these children need a place to live. So this is kind of a predecessor to our child welfare system. And so it happened for quite a number of years. It's estimated that over 100,000 children were transported from the East Coast to the Midwest to become parts of those families. So 1910 saw the development of our U.S. Children's Bureau, which investigated and reported on all matters pertaining to the welfare of children. This was a really big development in our country in terms of taking care of kids that did not have parents. Finally, we actually had investigations, we had statistics, and we had oversight. And so in 1917, Minnesota became the first state to actually require that adoptive parents be qualified to adopt. It was the first time anybody said, hey, we gotta check you out before we give you a kid. That was 1917. What was going on before then? But at the same time, in 1917, Minnesota was the first state to establish precedents that all adoptions were confidential. And that nobody could have access to adoptions records. And that remains the standard today in almost all states, which is a huge controversial issue right now as people want to seek out their identities and know where they came from, essentially. So the 40s, 50s, and 60s is the era that's called when the girls who went away. There's actually a book titled that, Girls Who Went Away. This is a period of time in which it's estimated that 1.5 million children were relinquished for adoption. And this was a period of time in which it was not socially acceptable to be pregnant and unmarried. These women were secreted away to family members, sometimes even to strangers, to houses where they would work, cleaning, cooking, taking care of other children, just to earn the right to stay in their home and be secreted away. A lot of these women were coerced into placing their children for adoption. It's actually a very dark period of time in adoption's history. Most of these women were not given the choice. Their family just told them that this is what was going to happen. And 1.5 million children is a lot. So then the 70s is really when we saw changes. And this is when adoptions met their peak in the 70s. It's estimated there were 175,000 adoptions that took place that year, and that was really the peak. But there also was a huge cultural shift that occurred. Access to birth control for single women became much more prevalent. The decision of Roe versus Wade also gave women the right to have an abortion should they choose. There was a lot less social stigma for women to be pregnant and unmarried. And at this time, you had the first of those 1.5 million children coming of age and advocating for their rights to know where they came from, who were their biological parents. And so it really was the start of the realization that maybe secrecy was not the best decision and the best choice for people. So, and those women who were still considering adoption in the 70s were demanding more control over their adoptions and for openness in adoptions as well. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, sometimes women didn't even know the gender of the child they had given birth to. The babies were whisked away and they knew nothing. There was absolutely no openness. They were told to get on with their lives, pretend it never happened. Don't even tell your husband, your future husband, that this had occurred. And they didn't know the families. They didn't get to select the families. So in the 70s, these women were really, women were saying they wanted something very different. And the children who had been adopted under that regime, if you will, were saying that they wanted something different as well. So the 1980s and the 1990s, the revolution kind of continues in adoption. And this is where the law of supply and demand really kicked in. You've got, the 80s is when the baby boomers started to become of age in which they wanted to create families. And so there was a huge increase in the number of people who were seeking to adopt in the 80s. And yet at the same time, there was a huge decrease in the number of women who were actually going to place their babies for adoption for all those reasons that we talked about previously. This is also the period of time when international adoptions grew absolutely dramatically. It was estimated that 1,700 children were brought into this country in 1964 for the purposes of adoption, but that number had increased to 15,724 by 1998. And it peaked, I don't remember the year, but it peaked at about 28,000 children being brought into this country for international adoption. But with the law of supply and demand, the cost of adoption went up pretty dramatically. And there was also a huge increase in the number of adoption agencies that were operating in the 70s and the 80s. I'm sorry, the 80s and the 90s. But this is also a period of time when there was a real revolution in the thinking about the social implications of adoption. This is when the research was beginning to show that grief, insecurity, and identity confusion are integral parts of adoption. These aren't things we can pretend don't exist. These aren't things that we can tell people to just ignore and they'll just go away, but that this is a part of this process that we need to be aware of, we need to accept, and we need to plan for and prepare people for. And this is both for the adoptee and their birth parents and also their adoptive parents as well. Then the internet came. Okay, the internet was a game changer when it came to adoption. So all of a sudden, people didn't need adoption agencies anymore. They could find each other on the internet. And all of a sudden, the do-it-yourself adoption became available not only to expectant parents, those who didn't really want to work with an adoption agency, but also prospective adoptive parents. It was another avenue for them to connect with people. It also provided a platform for openness in an adoption. All of a sudden, there was a method for them to communicate, whether it was by email or Facebook came along, or it was MySpace before that. And they could share information, they could share pictures, they could talk about the adoption, but they never had to exchange an address, a physical address. So that was a huge development. But it also created new ways to prey on women who were seeking to place their children for adoption. There's really incredible scams for hopeful prospective adoptive parents that have been created thanks to the internet, and it's created a whole new way to make money. At the end of the day, adoptions is something that people make money off of, and so anytime you have that, you have greed, and then you have some unethical practices. So let's talk a little bit about the scams, because those are kind of fun. I probably shouldn't say that, I'm sorry. Did you know you can fake a pregnancy really easily? There's a website. Anybody want the pads that go out and tell you, based on your months? My husband over here can get an ultrasound in his name. It's very easy to do. It's on the internet. You can get a kit on how to fake a pregnancy. So why would you do that? You'd fake a pregnancy because hopeful adoptive parents are willing to pay your living expenses during the course of your pregnancy. And so there are women and their partners who are serial scammers, and they will go from one hopeful family to the other and say that they're pregnant, say that they've chosen this couple to raise their child, milk them for living expenses, and then disappear. So it's happening a lot. The scams are getting more sophisticated. There's definitely red flags as a professional that I look for. when I'm working with a birth parent, or even if I'm representing an adoptive family, that I'm looking for and trying to figure out, is this a scam or not? If the birth parents know the legal language, I'm worried. You know, it's one thing if you've read some stuff on the internet, but it's a whole nother thing if you can speak my language. And so then I start to get really worried. If the focus is too much on how much money can I get? How much money do I get for my baby? We don't sell babies. You know, what kind of living circumstances are you in? How can we be of assistance in that way? So that's definitely a big red flag. If whether or not they have any plans after the adoption, the planned adoption, what's your future going to hold? Where are you going from here? What are you planning on doing? And if they have absolutely no plans, that's also a red flag. If they refuse to meet with you in person, there you go. So, but then also, you know, I worry about the women who are placing their children for adoption as well. And I do represent a lot of women who are making that brave choice. And I do get a little bit protective of them because I worry about the folks who are out there who are preying on them as well. With the internet came this huge development in something called adoption facilitators. They're not regulated. They could be nothing more than somebody sitting at their kitchen table and working from the internet and saying, we're going to create a match between these people. We found this birth mother out here, we advertised for her, and we advertised for family, and I'm just going to match them and earn $16,000, $15,000 for that. They offer no services. They don't ensure that it was even a good match. They oftentimes promise these women the world in terms of finances, a laptop, things like that. And so they bring them into their programs, match them with a family, and then they literally walk out. And oftentimes it's not a good match. So I'm always looking for that as well, because this is going to be a lifelong journey for folks. This is not a one and done. They are going to hopefully be developing a lifelong relationship, and you've got to make sure it's a good match and that it's a good fit for everyone. It's kind of like online dating. I do tell them that. And that it is about vetting and finding the right fit for families. So, and then in terms of ways that people make money off of adoptions, it's really, there's the facilitators. Those are probably the biggest offenders right now. But there's also a lot of companies that are willing to build a personal website for you if you're interested in holding yourself out there as somebody who wants to adopt. They'll do your SEO optimization, and they will give you this nice flashy website and so forth. So people are making money in that way. So it's just, it is an industry, and it's a way that people have seen to make money. So any questions? Yes. Search engine optimization. So how to make your website found when a birth mother types in something in a search engine. Did I see a hand over here? Okay. So, again, one of the biggest developments in adoption that's changed and that the internet certainly helped with is the benefits of openness. There's been a complete shift in the viewing of adoptions. It used to be something, again, that was secretive, confidential. Birth mother wouldn't know anything about the family that received her child. They would know nothing about her. And that's just not the case anymore. Now, most women who are interested in placing their babies for adoption choose the family that's going to adopt their child. And birth mothers who have, the research is showing that birth mothers that have ongoing contact report less grief, regret, and worry, and more peace of mind with their decision. And adoptive parents are also seeing a positive experience, and they have reduced fear and greater empathy towards the women who place their babies with them. So, and it's oftentimes a benefit to the adopted child to know where he or she came from. That's a huge part, the right to identity, the right to know, and to own that history. Even if that history is not pretty, it's theirs. And so the right to be able to know that is really important. So what do adoptions look like today? 95% of them have some degree of openness. And oftentimes that connection is direct through emails. There are a couple of website platforms that are similar to Facebook but are specific for adoptions. People exchange phone numbers, cell phones. They do text. They'll talk on the phone. They'll do Skype. I mean, it's really varied what people will do. Some will have dinner once a month. Some have a picnic once a year. It's just really, people say, well, I want an open adoption to me. They say that all the time. I'm like, okay, let's talk about what that can look like. Because the terms open and closed are colloquial terms. They're not legal definitions. So I need to know from the people I'm working with, well, what does that look like to you? How, what is it that you're thinking of for openness? Because that's a big part of a good match. And then in 2012, a survey of adoption professionals reported that 76 to 100% of their expectant parents were choosing their own families. That's, again, a complete shift from the 50s and 60s when they didn't know anything about the people they were placing. They were having their babies. Their babies were going to, so. And so just a few words. All of that what I was just talking about with adoption had to do with domestic infant adoptions. So nothing really to do with the child welfare system, Department of Child Safety, that kind of stuff. But today it's really important to know that when we talk about adoption, only a third of adoptions that we're even looking at in our court system are the model of an infant being adopted by a married couple. We have huge numbers of grandparents adopting. I mean, it's phenomenal, the number of grandparents that have stepped up to the plate to raise their grandchildren. A lot of relative adoptions, uncles, aunts, siblings. The opioid epidemic is only contributing to that. And right now the Department of Child Safety has always had the policy or that they needed to place children with families, that needed to be the priority for kids who were coming into the system. But we're seeing that, we're seeing a shift in the Department of Child Safety in that they are continuing to look for families even after kids have been in a foster placement for 2 or 3 years. So that's also a real shift. And not sure if that's really good for kids either, because once they've been with a family for 2 or 3 years, that's, in their eyes, that's their family. So, and so again, the infant adoptions is probably only a third of what we're even seeing in the court system for adoptions. Yes?
You didn't mention anything about foreign adoption. Is that different than, or is it the same?
It's completely different. So foreign adoptions, oh, I'm sorry, she asked, I didn't mention much about foreign adoption. I talked about just a little bit of the statistics, but in terms of the process, foreign adoptions are completely different. They're governed by the Hague Convention, so you have to go through a Hague-accredited adoption agency. And so international adoptions are the most expensive adoptions that you're going to be looking at. Families probably need to budget $50,000 or more for those adoptions. And the number of people who are actually pursuing that kind of adoption has plummeted dramatically. I think I said the peak was about 28,000. I think the number last year was down to 6,000. So a huge decrease in international adoptions. Some of that is because of the Hague Convention, because it makes it so much more challenging. And the things that people have to go through in terms of the home studies and approval process is enormous. Then they have to travel to the country and oftentimes stay for several weeks at a time to get their child. So it's something that has become really cost prohibitive, time prohibitive, and so it's not an option that a lot of people are looking at anymore. So, yeah.
Just to kind of on the back of what you're saying, the cost is more of with the travel and all the associated, not the actual process itself. Because I was just somewhere on Saturday and they were talking about that the international adoptions are actually less expensive, but maybe all the associated administrative costs are more expensive. Is that?
It's the travel that tends to really get to families, and that's where the expense definitely goes up. But the agency fees are higher. in international adoptions in general. So if you're looking to adopt domestically, and you're going to work with an adoption agency to help you find that child, you're probably looking at an adoption agency fee of somewhere between $25,000 and $45,000. And then most of the international adoption agencies, it's $45,000 and up, just for the agency fees. So,
thank you. Diane here. Do you see a lot of foster families adopting the ones that they're fostering? And, any statistics on that?
I don't have any statistics off the top of my head. There are a lot of foster families that do end up adopting the children that they've had in their home. But it's a very arduous process for them. I mean, these folks have opened their home up and their hearts up to these kids. And the very first goal of the Department of Child Safety is reunification of those children to their birth parents. And so when a child comes into their home, they're told from the get-go that there's a very good chance this child is going to go home to the birth parents, or the state has the obligation to search out family members. So those kids could leave their home in a very short period of time. So I just wanted to finish with the cost question. The cost of advertising is a big component. The cost of counseling is a huge component as well. A lot of the larger adoption agencies, in order to truly serve the generation of women who are of childbearing years, they need to be staffed 24/7. And they need to be staffed on different mediums. It's not just phones, it's text messaging, it's email. And so they need to be available to these women to provide that emotional support 24/7 and across different platforms. So that's another huge part of the cost.
Heather?
So, yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask you about what are the current tax credits that are allowable domestically and foreign? Are they different?
They aren't different whether it's domestic or foreign. There is an adoption tax credit. It's $13,570 this year. And so if you have expended funds for an adoption, even if that adoption failed and wasn't completed, you can claim the adoption tax credit up to that amount. If you're adopting a child through the foster care system, and that child qualified for something called adoption subsidy, you've actually met the IRS definition of adopting a child who's considered special needs, which allows you to take the entire tax credit, even if you didn't pay anything for the adoption. So, unfortunately, though, we are anticipating that the adoption tax credit is going to be eliminated in the major tax reforms that are going to take place. Certainly, those of us who are involved are launching a campaign and trying to preserve it, but it's probably going to disappear. So, which is just going to make adoption more expensive for families. So. Any other questions? I don't think I have any more slides.
Hold on.
Yes.
Go back to something you had said in the 60s and 70s. My father was an attorney here in Tucson, and back in the 60s and beginning of the 70s, I guess in New York there was some kind of law about if the adopted parents were Catholic, they had to be from a Catholic. If they were Jewish, it had to be a baby from a Jewish. So my dad had a relationship with an attorney in Brooklyn, and for several years there were babies going back and forth, and I took a baby back when I was 17. I was a senior in high school, and it was quite an emotional experience to take this baby back and have it adopted, and it was quite something. But that was an unusual law, and I guess they loosened it up or whatever at the time.
Right. There's no longer restrictions on who can adopt,
Yeah.
and whether that's race or religion. It's, again, birth mothers are in the driver's seat. They pick the family that they want to adopt their child. You see all kinds of interesting and beautiful families created as a result of that. So, but that's a really interesting story. So, yeah, I got to take a baby home once. Can I just share my baby story? So my husband was fantastic because I texted him a picture of a baby in a baby carrier, and I said, I'm bringing home work tonight, and I'm going to be up all night.
Not exactly true. I'm bringing work home tonight, and she's going to stay.
She's going to say, okay, all right. So anyway, the baby had to be discharged from the hospital. Birth mother had selected a family. They were racing to get here, and there was flooding in the Midwest. I mean, they just couldn't get to Tucson. And so it was flight after flight. She's sitting in her office. My staff and I are all loving on this beautiful little girl. And they said, we're not making it. We can't get there. Our flights are canceled. So I called the birth mother, and I explained the situation. I said, we're going to have to find cradle care. And she's crying, and she's saying, no, I don't want that. I don't trust anyone but you. Please, will you take care of her? And I'm like, oh, my God, this is the dumbest thing I've ever done. But I took her home. But the best part of the story is that I looked at my staff, and I said, we need to give her a name. And I said, let's just name her Lily Rose, something floral. And a couple hours later, the adoptive family checked in. And I said, hey, what name have you chosen for this baby? We want to call her by what you're going to select for. And they said, Lily. So, yeah. So that's one of those, goosebump experiences where you're like, oh, my goodness. So anyway, does anybody have any other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much. You've really been a pleasure to be in front of.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much.